Winter came early to a small mountain town in Colorado. Snow covered the roads, the rooftops, and the quiet lives of people who thought they had already seen everything life could take from them. A 68-year-old sheriff was counting down his final days before retirement, believing his time of saving others was over. Then one night, a single image appeared on his phone, a dying German Shepherd puppy, a choice that no one asked him to make. What happened next would change the meaning of that winter forever. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from today. And if stories of hope, second chances, and quiet miracles matter to you, please press subscribe to support our channel and walk this journey with us. Winter arrived early in Silver Creek, Colorado, the kind of mountain winter that did not announce itself loudly, but instead settled in with authority. Snow clung to rooftops and telephone wires, pressed flat against the streets, and turned the town into a study of silence. Silver Creek was small, one main road, a handful of diners and hardware stores, a post office that still closed for lunch, and a white-steepled church whose bells marked time more faithfully than clocks. In December, the town smelled of pine sap, wood smoke, and cold iron, and the mountains that ringed it stood like old witnesses, unmoved by human calendars. It was the sort of place where winter was not a season, but a test, and where people learned early that endurance mattered more than speed. Officer Matthew Hale had lived through 47 winters like this. At 68, he was tall but stooped now, his height softened by time and responsibility. His shoulders were still broad, shaped by decades in uniform, but they carried a permanent heaviness, as if he had never fully set down the weight of his badge. His hair, once dark and thick, had faded into a thin silver halo, and his face bore the geography of long service. Deep lines at the corners of his mouth from restraint rather than laughter, a furrow between his brows carved by years of hard decisions. His eyes were pale blue, steady and observant, the eyes of a man who had spent his life watching for what might go wrong. Matthew was not unkind, but he was reserved, economical with words, and deeply uncomfortable with praise. People in Silver Creek trusted him, not because he smiled easily, but because he stayed. On the kitchen table of his modest house sat the artifacts of his life, as it now was. His sheriff's badge lay flat beside a small plastic bottle of heart medication, the label already smudged from frequent handling. Next to it rested an old leather notebook, its spine cracked, pages swollen with years of ink and weather. Inside were names, dates, half-sketched maps, and brief notes. Lost hikers, domestic calls, stranded motorists, the quiet tragedies that never made newspapers. The house itself was clean but spare, furnished more for function than comfort. Matthew lived alone and had for many years after a marriage that ended not with drama but with erosion. He had not remarried. He told people he liked the quiet, and that was partly true. But the deeper truth was that silence had become familiar, and familiarity felt safer than hope. Matthew was counting down his last winter before retirement. The town council had held a modest farewell luncheon the week before, complete with store-bought cake and speeches that made him shift in his chair. Retirement was supposed to be a reward, a well-earned rest, but to Matthew it felt like standing at the edge of a dark room, uncertain of where to step next. Policing had not been his job. It had been his structure. Without it, time stretched uncomfortably wide. That afternoon, the snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes, thickening the quiet. Matthew stood by the kitchen window for a long moment, watching the road, as if expecting a call that would never come. Eventually, he returned to the table and picked up his phone, scrolling through community alerts. It was a habit he could not seem to break. Even off-duty, even approaching retirement, some part of him remained tuned to the needs of others, alert for disruption. Lost dogs, weather advisories, church bake sales, Christmas discounts. His thumb moved automatically. Then he saw a post that almost disappeared beneath the clutter. It came from a small mountain veterinary clinic on the outskirts of town, the kind of place with one operating room and staff who did not count hours. The post was brief and plainly written, without embellishment or emotional appeal. It showed a photograph of a German Shepherd puppy lying on a metal table, fur matted, eyes open, but quiet. The puppy was very young, no more than 3 months old, with oversized paws and a coat that was still soft around the muzzle, black and tan in the classic pattern. One ear lay flat, the other half lifted, as if undecided. The caption read, "Name, Noel, age, approximately 12 weeks. Condition: internal injuries following an accident. Surgery required before midnight. Funding urgently needed. Matthew's thumb paused. He told himself he had seen things like this before. Animals were hurt every day, people too. He had learned long ago that he could not respond to every call for help, that restraint was not cruelty, but necessity. He almost scrolled past. Then he looked at the puppy's eyes. They were dark, glossy, and unnervingly calm. There was no panic in them, no frantic plea. Instead, there was something else, a steady, watchful stillness that Matthew recognized instantly. It was the same look he had seen in young soldiers brought in from accidents years ago when he'd served as a reserve deputy attached to emergency response units. The look of someone too tired or too hurt to ask for anything, but still unwilling to let go. The memory came unbidden, sharp and unwelcome. Another memory followed it, one he had never spoken aloud. Years earlier, during a winter pursuit, a police K-9 had been struck and critically injured. The dog had been brave, trained, loyal. Budget approvals were delayed. Decisions were deferred. The dog died on a stretcher under fluorescent lights while paperwork caught up to reality. Matthew had stood there, helpless and furious, feeling the limits of systems he had once trusted. His phone vibrated softly in his hand, a notification from a local hardware store advertising Christmas lights. Matthew exhaled slowly. He placed the phone down and stood, pacing the length of the kitchen. His heart beat a little faster than it should have, a reminder of his own fragility. At the window again, he watched the snow thicken, watched as the church down the road began, testing its bells for Christmas Eve, the sound faint but insistent, cutting through the cold air. Matthew told himself he was retired in all but name. He told himself he had already given enough. He told himself that one more choice would not change the world. He returned to the table and picked up the phone. The donation page loaded slowly, the signal weakened by weather. He read the clinic's words again, noting their lack of sentiment. They were not asking for miracles, just time, just a chance. Matthew did not feel certain. He did not feel heroic. He felt tired, old, and acutely aware of how many winters he had left. But he also felt something else, something stubborn and familiar, rising despite his caution. He pressed pay. The confirmation screen appeared, impersonal and efficient. The sound it made was barely audible, but to Matthew it felt like a door closing and another opening at the same time. He sat down heavily in his chair, one hand resting on the table near his badge, the other covering the steadying rise and fall of his chest. Outside, the snow continued to fall, indifferent and endless. Inside, for the first time in a long while, Matthew Hale had made a choice, not because he was certain it would succeed, but because he could not bear the cost of doing nothing. Morning did not arrive gently in Silver Creek. It crept in under a lid of gray clouds, turning the snow from white to the color of old ash. The mountains looked closer than usual, as if the cold had drawn them in, tight around the town. Roads were glazed with ice, and the air carried that sharp, metallic bite that warned even the experienced to move carefully. For Matthew Hale, winter mornings like this had once meant duty. Now, with retirement only weeks away, they meant something more unsettling, choice without orders. He drove his patrol truck slowly, both hands steady on the wheel, eyes scanning the curves of the mountain pass that led to the veterinary clinic. The vehicle was older, well-maintained, practical, like Matthew himself. Each turn of the road tugged faintly at his chest, not pain exactly, but pressure, the quiet reminder that his heart was no longer a tool he could take for granted. He breathed evenly, as he had taught himself to do after the first scare years ago, letting the rhythm settle him. The clinic sat at the edge of town, a low building half buried by snowbanks, its windows glowing softly against the cold. A hand-painted sign near the entrance read, "Mountain Ridge Veterinary Care." The place had been there as long as Matthew could remember, serving ranchers, hunters, and the occasional family pet with equal seriousness. He parked and sat for a moment before getting out, telling himself again that he was only here to confirm payment. Just procedure. That was the lie he needed to move. Inside, warmth and smell hit him at once. Antiseptic, wet fur, faint traces of disinfectant and coffee. The soundscape was subdued, a phone ringing in the back, the hum of heaters, the soft shuffle of staff moving quickly but quietly. Matthew removed his gloves and stamped snow from his boots, suddenly aware of how out of place he felt, without his uniform jacket zipped all the way up, the badge no longer heavy on his chest, but absent, like a missing tooth. At the front desk stood a young veterinary technician, whose name tag read Lily, though Matthew would later forget her last name. She was in her early 20s, petite, with tired brown eyes and hair pulled into a loose bun that had clearly been tightened and retightened through a long night. Her movements were efficient but gentle, suggesting someone who had learned early that calm could be contagious. She recognized Matthew immediately, not by name, but by posture. People in Silver Creek often recognized him that way. "You're here about Noel," she said softly, not as a question. Matthew nodded. "I just need to make sure everything went through." Lily offered a small, tired smile. "The surgery was completed late last night. The doctor can speak with you." She led him down a narrow hallway, past exam rooms and storage closets, to a glass-walled recovery area. And there, lying in a kennel under a thin blanket, was the puppy from the photograph. Up close, Noel looked, smaller than Matthew had expected. His body was slight, still awkward with youth, ribs faintly visible beneath his fur. One hind leg had been shaved clean for the IV line, the skin beneath pale and vulnerable. His chest rose and fell too quickly, each breath shallow but determined. His ears twitched once as Matthew approached, though his eyes remained half-lidded, dark and watchful, even through the haze of medication. Dr. Andrew Collins entered quietly from the side. He was a man in his mid-50s, average height, with graying hair and hands that bore the subtle tremor of fatigue rather than age. His face was lined not by worry, but by repetition, the expression of someone who had delivered both good and bad news too many times to count. Collins was known in the region for his honesty. Ranchers trusted him because he did not sugarcoat outcomes, and Matthew respected him for the same reason. "The procedure itself went as well as we could hope," Collins said, folding his arms loosely. "No internal bleeding now, but he came in weak, dehydrated. Recovery is where things get uncertain." Matthew watched Noel's breathing. "What are we talking about?" Collins did not hesitate. 50%. The words hung between them, stark and unadorned. Matthew nodded once, the way he had nodded through countless briefings over the years. 50%. A coin toss. He had lived most of his life in that margin, where preparation met chance, where outcomes were never guaranteed. He understood that number better than most. In the corner of the room, someone shifted. Matthew turned and noticed a young woman sitting on a plastic chair, knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if trying to stay together. This was Emily Ross, though Matthew would learn her name only moments later. She was 26, slender, with pale skin and dark circles beneath her eyes that spoke of exhaustion rather than illness. Her brown hair was pulled into a low ponytail, strands falling loose around her face. She wore a thin diner uniform under an oversized coat, the kind that had once belonged to someone else and had been borrowed without much thought for appearance. Emily had the look of someone who apologized too often, even when not at fault. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to listen. He's mine." Matthew inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her presence without intruding. Emily continued, words tumbling out unevenly. "I work at the Pine Street Diner. 2 jobs, actually. I found him behind the dumpsters last week. He followed me home. I named him Noel because it was snowing, and because, I don't know, he felt like something that was supposed to mean hope." She swallowed hard. "When the accident happened, I brought him here, but I didn't have enough. I never do." Her shoulders shook, but she did not cry loudly. Instead, tears slid down her face. In silence, the way of someone who had learned that public grief was inconvenient. Matthew listened without comment. He recognized the cadence of her explanation. He had heard it from parents, from spouses, from people standing at the edge of their limits. The words changed, but the meaning rarely did. "I didn't abandon him," Emily said finally. "I just couldn't afford to keep him alive." That sentence landed with more weight than any accusation could have. Matthew looked back at Noel, at the small body fighting quietly under fluorescent lights. He thought of budgets, of delayed approvals, of all the times systems had failed not out of cruelty, but arithmetic. Dr. Collins cleared his throat gently. "He'll need close monitoring for the next few weeks. medication, physical rest, someone who can watch him. Emily nodded immediately. I can do that. I'll do anything. But the doctor's expression remained cautious. We'll talk about options once he's stable. Matthew felt something shift inside him. Not resolve, not yet, but recognition. 50% was not nothing. It was possibility. It was also risk. And risk was something he had spent a lifetime managing for others, rarely for himself. He reached into his pocket and felt the edge of his old notebook, the familiar texture grounding him. For a moment, he imagined walking out, letting the professionals decide the rest. That would be reasonable, responsible even. Instead, he heard himself ask, what does he need right now? Dr. Collins met his gaze. Time, he said simply, and someone willing to stand in the uncertainty. Matthew exhaled slowly. Outside, the wind pushed snow against the clinic windows, the world pressing in. Inside, a quiet standoff unfolded, not between people, but between fear and commitment. Matthew did not yet make another promise, but as he stood there, watching the steady, stubborn rise of a small chest, he understood something with sudden clarity. 50% was still a chance, and sometimes that was enough to change a life. By the third day, winter had tightened its grip on Silver Creek. Snow no longer fell gently. It packed itself into corners, hardened into ridges along the road, and creaked beneath boots like brittle glass. The town moved more slowly now. Deliveries were late, conversations shorter. In places like Silver Creek, people did not fight winter. They adapted to it, conserving warmth, words, and energy. Matthew Hale understood this rhythm better than most. He had lived his life learning when to act and when to wait. What unsettled him now was that waiting felt heavier than action. He returned to the veterinary clinic each morning under the same pretense, checking on paperwork, confirming updates, making sure nothing had been mishandled. Each visit was a quiet negotiation with himself. He told no one he was coming. He did not want acknowledgement. He wanted facts. Noel remained alive. That alone felt like an achievement, though Matthew knew survival was not the same as recovery. The puppy's condition had stabilized, but just barely. His movements were minimal, carefully monitored. His breathing had slowed, but fatigue lingered in every muscle. Noel was still small, still fragile, still very much balanced between staying and slipping away. Dr. Andrew Collins continued to speak plainly. He's not out of danger, he said on the third morning, his voice steady but unsentimental. And he won't be, not for a while. Puppies bounce back faster than adults, but only if someone's watching closely. Matthew leaned against the counter, arms crossed, absorbing the information like a report from dispatch. What happens if no one is? Collins did not answer immediately. He glanced through the glass at Noel, then back at Matthew. We can transfer him to a rescue facility in Denver. They have more staff, more space. But there's a waiting list, and it's a long drive. New environment, new stress. Matthew imagined the city. Noise, unfamiliar smells, constant motion. He imagined Noel's small body adjusting again, over and over, to new hands, new voices. He had seen what displacement did to people. Animals were no different. In the waiting area, Emily Ross sat hunched over her phone, refreshing a bank app she already knew the balance of. She looked smaller each day, as if exhaustion were folding her inward. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but she still showed up, still asked questions, still whispered to Noel through the glass, even when she thought no one was listening. Emily was not strong in the way movies depicted strength, but she was persistent, and Matthew recognized that as a quieter, more durable form. I can't take him home like this, she admitted that afternoon, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it steady. I live in a studio. I work doubles. If something happened while I was gone... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Matthew nodded. He did not offer comfort. He offered understanding, which was sometimes rarer. A representative from the local rescue network arrived later that day. A woman named Janice Walker, late 40s, practical haircut, sensible boots, clipboard always under one arm. Janice had spent most of her adult life coordinating transfers, fostering arrangements, and emergency placements. She was efficient, empathetic, and tired in the way of someone who cared deeply, but was always short on time. When she spoke, it was with the careful neutrality of someone used to delivering limited options. We need to make a plan, Janice said, standing with Matthew and Dr. Collins near the recovery room. "If Noel doesn't have a stable foster within the week, we'll need to move him to Denver. It's not ideal, but it's what we can do." Matthew felt the word move land like a weight in his chest. Janice glanced at him, assessing. "We sometimes ask for short-term fosters, 30 days, just to get them through the worst." Matthew's response was immediate, reflexive. "No." The word came out sharper than he intended, but he did not soften it. "I'm retiring," he continued, more controlled now. "My heart isn't in great shape. I shouldn't start something I can't finish." Janice nodded slowly, accepting the boundary without argument. She had learned long ago not to push people past their limits. "I understand," she said simply. Later that evening, they opened Noel's kennel for supervised movement. The room was quiet, the clinic winding down for the day. Matthew stood back, arms at his sides, watching with a distance he told himself was necessary. Noel stepped out cautiously. His gait was uneven, his body still adjusting to pain and weakness. He did not run toward Emily. He did not shy away from strangers. He took 3 careful steps, then stopped. He walked toward Matthew. It was not dramatic. No wagging tail, no sudden leap. Just a slow, deliberate approach, guided by something quieter than instinct. Noel reached Matthew's boots and rested his head against the worn leather, the contact light but unmistakable. The room seemed to pause. Matthew did not move. He felt the warmth through the boot, the faint pressure of trust offered without demand. His chest tightened, not with pain, but with recognition. He had felt this before, though never from a dog. The unspoken question, the wordless acknowledgement between 2 beings who carried damage but had not surrendered. Janice watched silently. Emily held her breath. Matthew stared at the scuffed toe of his boot, at the small head leaning there, and felt the weight of years press in around him. He thought of retirement mornings without purpose, of empty rooms, of winters measured only by medication schedules and weather reports. He thought of all the times he had told himself no for good reasons. Finally, he spoke. 30 days, he said, his voice low, firm. No promises beyond that. Janice exhaled softly, relief flickering. Across her professional composure, Emily's hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling freely now. "That's all we ask," Janice said. Matthew looked down at Noel, who had not moved, as if the puppy understood that stillness mattered. Outside, snow began to fall again, thicker than before, coating the world in white, as if winter itself were recording a temporary vow. Matthew Hale did not know if he was making the right decision. He only knew that walking away now would cost more than staying. And some choices, once made, carried a weight that changed the shape of everything that followed. Matthew Hale's house had always been quiet, but now the silence felt different, as if it were listening. The building sat on the edge of Silver Creek, a single-story structure with weathered siding and a porch that had been shoveled so many times the wood beneath showed through in pale streaks. Snowbanks leaned against the steps like tired sentries. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old books, brewed coffee, and the medicinal sharpness of winter. It was not a lonely house exactly, but it was a cautious one, shaped by a man who had learned to take up as little space as possible in his own life. Noel arrived wrapped in blankets and rules. Dr. Collins had gone over them carefully, limited movement, medication twice a day, no stairs, no excitement. Matthew listened the way he always did when instructions mattered, nodding, memorizing, asking precise questions. At home, he laid out towels on the living room floor, cleared space near the couch, and set alarms on his phone for pills that were not his own. The old patrol discipline came back easily. Caring, it turned out, was not unfamiliar. What was unfamiliar was the vulnerability involved. Noel was quiet that first night, too quiet for a puppy his age. He lay where Matthew placed him, head resting on his paws, eyes following every movement with calm attentiveness. His body was still thin, his hind leg stiff, and there was a faint tremor that ran through him when he shifted positions. The shaved patch on his leg made him look unfinished, as if part of him had been left behind at the clinic. Matthew sat in his armchair and watched him, the same way he had once watched sleeping suspects in hospital rooms, alert to the smallest change. Neither of them slept well. Matthew woke often, heart thudding unevenly, listening for sounds that would indicate trouble. Each time, Noel was there, breathing, eyes open or closed depending on the hour, as if keeping his own quiet watch. There was no dramatic bonding moment, no sudden rush of affection. What grew instead was familiarity. The soft scrape of claws on hardwood, the careful lift of a small head when Matthew stood, the way Noel learned quickly where not to step, avoiding the rug, the chair legs, the narrow hallway that made him uneasy. On the third day the accident happened. Matthew had been tired, the kind of tired that settled into the bones rather than the muscles. He had slept poorly, his chest tight from stress rather than pain, and the snow outside showed no sign of relenting. Noel, on medication that disrupted his routine, misjudged his body and had an accident on the living room rug. It was small, inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, but it was there, undeniable and inconvenient. Matthew reacted before he thought. His voice rose, sharp and commanding, cutting through the quiet. No. The word echoed louder than it should have. Noel froze instantly. His ears flattened against his head. His body went rigid, as if bracing for something worse. The calm watchfulness vanished, replaced by a stillness that was not obedience but fear. The sight stopped Matthew cold. In that frozen posture, he saw himself, not as he was now, but as he had been decades earlier. Younger, faster, louder. A man who believed control equaled safety, who mistook authority for clarity. He remembered shouting at rookies, at suspects, at himself. He remembered moments when his voice had been the last thing someone heard before something broke permanently. His chest tightened, and this time it was not his heart. Matthew lowered himself to the floor slowly, every joint protesting. His knees ached as they hit the hardwood. He reached out but stopped short of touching Noel, aware that trust, once shaken, did not return on command. "It's all right," he said, softer now, the edge gone. "I'm sorry. We'll learn again?" Noel did not move right away. Then, cautiously, his ears lifted a fraction. His breathing eased. The tension left his body in small increments, like ice melting rather than shattering. Matthew cleaned the rug without further comment, the act grounding him. When he returned, Noel shifted closer, not touching, but near enough to matter. From that moment, something changed. Matthew became deliberate in a new way. He spoke less, moved slower. He paid attention not just to what Noel did, but to how he reacted, how pain and memory shaped behavior. He began to recognize the signs before they escalated, the stiffness, the hesitation, the look that said, "I don't understand what you want from me." It humbled him. He had spent his career reading people under pressure, but this required a different skill, patience without authority. Noel learned, too. He learned the sound of the pill bottle meant relief, not threat. He learned the armchair was Matthew's, but the space beside it was safe. He learned that hands could be firm without being cruel. His movements grew steadier, his gaze more curious. He followed Matthew from room to room, not out of neediness, but attentiveness, as if cataloging the habits of this quiet man who smelled of winter and old leather. They walked slowly in the backyard, when weather allowed, the snow crunching underfoot. Matthew wore his old coat, the one with the frayed cuffs, and leaned on the porch rail when he needed to. Noel stayed close, adjusting his pace instinctively. Neighbors passed by, offering nods, comments, the occasional joke about the sheriff finally getting back up. Matthew deflected them all with brief smiles. This was not something he wanted public yet. Some things needed to grow without witnesses. At night, the house settled into a new rhythm. Matthew's heart medication alarms chimed alongside Noel's. They rested in the same room, separate but aware, two damaged bodies negotiating space. Matthew found himself talking aloud sometimes, not to Noel specifically, but not away from him either. Small observations, reminders. Once, a quiet confession about a case he never forgot. Noel listened without judgment, his presence steady. Neither of them healed quickly. Noel's limp remained, a reminder of what had happened. Matthew's heart remained unreliable, his body slower than his instincts. But there was progress, measured not in milestones, but in absence. Fewer flinches, fewer alarms, fewer nights where fear dominated the room. Matthew realized something unsettling and profound in those weeks. He was not fixing Noel, and Noel was not fixing him. They were simply learning how to exist with damage, without pretending it wasn't there. In a town that measured worth by usefulness, that felt radical. Winter continued its quiet occupation of Silver Creek. Snow piled, melted, and froze again. The church bells rang on Sundays. Life went on. Inside the house, two beings moved carefully through shared space, neither leading, neither retreating, discovering that healing was not about erasing the past, but about choosing not to let it dictate the future. They were learning each other's damage, and for now, that was enough. Christmas Eve came wrapped in mourning. The sky over Silver Creek hung low and heavy, clouds pressing down until the mountains seemed to disappear entirely. By late afternoon, snow began to fall sideways, driven by wind that rattled windows and scoured the roads, clean of tire tracks almost as quickly as they were made. The town prepared the way it always did, quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. Porch lights stayed on. Extra firewood was stacked. People checked in on neighbors without needing to be asked. In places like Silver Creek, winter emergencies were not surprises. They were reminders. Matthew Hale spent the early evening doing what he told himself were sensible preparations. He filled a thermos with coffee, set out extra blankets, checked his medication, and charged his phone while there was still power. He moved carefully, listening to his body the way a veteran listened to weather. His heart had been unsettled all day. Not painful exactly, but irregular enough to demand attention. He dismissed it as fatigue, retirement paperwork, disrupted sleep, the low-grade stress of responsibility he pretended he no longer carried. He had survived worse nights than this. Noel watched him from the rug near the armchair. The puppy was stronger now, his frame filling out slowly, though the limp remained. His coat had regained some shine, and his eyes were brighter, more alert. At nearly 4 months old, Noel was still young, still learning, but there was a steadiness to him that felt older than his body. He did not pace or whine as the wind picked up. He observed, head tilted slightly, ears tracking sounds beyond the walls. There was no fear in him, only attention. By nightfall, the power went out. The house fell into sudden, absolute silence, broken only by the wind and the distant crack of a branch giving way under snow. Matthew stood still, listening, instinctively counting seconds. He reached for the flashlight he kept by the door, switching it on with a practiced flick. The beam cut a narrow path through the darkened room. "All right," he murmured, more to himself than to Noel. "We've handled worse." The phone showed no signal. That did not surprise him. Snow like this swallowed towers whole. Roads would be impassable by morning, maybe sooner. He considered calling someone. Janice, the rescue coordinator, perhaps, but dismissed it. There was nothing anyone could do tonight. This was a waiting storm. Matthew lowered himself into the armchair, the old fabric creaking beneath his weight. Noel shifted closer, lying within reach but not touching. Outside, the wind howled louder, testing the house. Somewhere down the road, a transformer popped faintly, a dull thud carried on the storm. The church bells did not ring tonight. Christmas Eve passed without music. The first wave of discomfort came quietly. It began as a tightness beneath Matthew's sternum, subtle enough that he might have ignored it on another night. He adjusted. His posture took a measured breath, waited. The sensation did not ease. Instead, it spread, radiating outward like cold through metal. His pulse quickened, uneven, skipping where it should not. He closed his eyes, counting, grounding himself in the techniques he had learned after the first incident years ago. Not dangerous yet, he told himself. Not critical, but fear has a way of bending logic. Images rose unbidden. A partner slumped against a squad car after a chase gone wrong, the sound of a radio crackling unanswered, the sterile smell of hospital corridors at 3 a.m. He felt the old panic press in, the sense of being alone in a moment when others depended on him. His breathing grew shallow. Noel lifted his head. The puppy stood, joints stiff but determined. He did not bark. He did not whine. He did not circle in confusion. Instead, he climbed carefully onto the armchair, placing his weight deliberately so as not to jostle Matthew. His movements were slow, thoughtful, as if guided by something deeper than training. Noel pressed his body against Matthew's chest. The contact was warm, solid. The puppy settled with surprising confidence, resting his head directly over Matthew's heart. His breathing was slow, steady, a rhythm that did not falter despite the storm, despite the darkness. He exhaled softly, again and again, a metronome of calm. Matthew froze, startled by the intimacy of the gesture. Then, instinctively, his hand came to rest on Noel's back. The fur beneath his palm was thick, real, alive. He felt the rise and fall of the small body, the unwavering cadence of breath. He matched it without realizing. In, out, slower now. The tightness in his chest did not vanish, but it loosened, just enough to allow air. The panic receded, not banished, but held at bay. Matthew's heartbeat began to steady, aligning itself with the warmth against him. Tears came unexpectedly, slipping down his temples into his hair. He did not sob. He did not speak. He simply allowed himself to stay still, held in place by a creature that should not have been responsible for such a task. For the first time in his life, Matthew understood something he had never permitted himself to consider. He was not the one standing watch tonight. All those years, patrolling streets, answering calls, bearing the weight of outcomes he could not control, had taught him vigilance, but not surrender. He had believed that rest came only after duty, that safety was something he provided, never received. And yet here he was, in the dark, in a storm, alive because a wounded puppy had chosen to lie across his heart and breathe. The storm raged on. Snow piled against the windows, sealing the house in white. The world beyond shrank to the size of a living room, illuminated by a single flashlight beam left glowing on the floor. Time lost its edges. Eventually, Matthew's breathing normalized. The danger passed, not because it was defeated, but because it was endured. He remained still long after, unwilling to disturb the balance they had found. Noel did not move either. He stayed, unwavering, a quiet sentinel. Sometime after midnight, the wind softened. The house creaked less. The storm began its slow retreat, leaving behind a silence deeper than before. Matthew whispered, his voice rough, "Thank you." Noel did not respond, but his tail tapped once, gently, against the armrest. Outside, Christmas arrived without bells, without light, without witnesses. Inside, an old man and a young dog shared a night that neither would ever forget. When morning eventually came, pale and exhausted, Silver Creek would dig itself out again. Roads would reopen. Phones would find signals. Life would resume. But something fundamental had shifted in that darkened house. Matthew Hale had spent his life guarding others through the night. And on this Christmas Eve, for the first time, he had been guarded. Spring arrived in Silver Creek the way it always did, late, hesitant, and without apology. Snow lingered in the shadows long after the calendar insisted it should be gone, packed hard along fence lines and beneath pine trees, stubborn reminders of the winter that had refused to release its hold easily. The town woke more slowly now. Ice loosened its grip on the roads. Roofs began to drip steadily through the afternoons. People opened windows an inch at a time, testing the air as if trust had to be rebuilt. Matthew Hale noticed the change not because of the weather, but because of the sound of it. Water moved again. He stood at the kitchen sink one morning, watching meltwater carve narrow paths through the snowbank outside the window, when he realized he had not woken up to silence. There had been claws on the floor. A soft, uneven rhythm, familiar now. Footsteps that did not belong to him. Noel sat by the door, waiting. The puppy, no longer quite a puppy, was taller, sturdier, though the limp remained, a permanent signature of the winter they had survived. His coat was thick and glossy again, black and tan catching the morning light. One ear still refused to stand fully upright, giving him a perpetually inquisitive look. At nearly 6 months old, Noel had grown into his body, but not out of his attentiveness. He watched Matthew the way some people listen to prayer, quietly, completely. Matthew's own body had not changed much. He still took his medication on schedule. His heart still demanded respect. But something inside him had loosened, unknotted just enough to make room for routine that did not revolve around duty. He moved through the house differently now, less guarded, less braced. That morning marked his official retirement. There was no ceremony, no handshake in front of the town hall, no speeches or plaques. The badge had already been returned weeks earlier, placed in a plain envelope with paperwork that reduced decades of service to dates and signatures. Matthew had not lingered over it. He had learned long ago that endings did not need witnesses to be real. He dressed simply, an old flannel shirt, worn jeans, boots softened by years of use. Noel followed him as he moved from room to room, not underfoot, but near enough to register presence. When Matthew stopped, Noel stopped. When Matthew turned, Noel adjusted. They had learned each other's pace. The rescue center called just before noon. Janice Walker's voice came through the line, practical as ever, but warm. "We're checking in about Noel," she said. "He's cleared the critical phase. We have a transport heading to Denver next week. Unless... Matthew looked down at Noel, who sat beside his chair, tail resting on the floor, eyes calm. He thought of the vet bills folded and magneted to the refrigerator, not as a reminder of cost, but of choice. He thought of the storm, the dark, the weight on his chest, and the small body that had steadied him when no one else could. "No," Matthew said. "There won't be a transfer." There was a pause, brief but telling. "Are you sure?" Janice asked gently. "This would mean a permanent placement, adoption paperwork, responsibility." Matthew did not hesitate. "I know." Emily Ross arrived later that afternoon, carrying a paper bag that smelled faintly of sugar and cinnamon. She looked different than she had at the clinic, still slender, still tired, but lighter somehow. Her hair was brushed back neatly, her diner uniform replaced by jeans and a sweater that actually fit. She smiled when she saw Noel, kneeling carefully to greet him. Noel leaned into her hands, tail wagging once, then returned to Matthew's side. Emily laughed softly through tears. "I guess he decided." Matthew allowed himself a small smile. "Looks that way." They sat at the kitchen table, the late winter sun slanting across the worn wood. Emily thanked him, awkwardly at first, then with more certainty, her words tumbling over each other. Matthew waved most of it away. Gratitude made him uncomfortable. He preferred facts. "I couldn't have done it," Emily said finally, her voice steady now. "Not alone, I know that." Matthew nodded. "None of us do much alone," he said. It surprised him to hear himself say it, but it rang true. The adoption papers were simple: a name, an address, a signature, no fanfare. The pen scratched softly across the page, the sound louder than it should have been in the quiet house. When Matthew finished, he placed the papers neatly in a folder, his hands steady. That evening, he cooked dinner for the first time in weeks, something more than soup or toast. The act felt ceremonial in its ordinariness. Noel lay nearby, watching, occasionally lifting his head at the sound of a pan or a dropped utensil. Outside, the last of the snow reflected the fading light, pink and gold. Afterward, Matthew stood at the door, looking out over the yard. The mountains were visible again, their outlines softened by distance rather than storm. He realized, not without surprise, that he was not afraid of the time ahead. It was still unknown, still unstructured, but it was not empty. Later, as night settled, Matthew placed the old vet bill back on the refrigerator, smoothing it flat beneath the magnet shaped like a pine tree. It stayed there, not as a reminder of money spent, but of the moment when he had chosen not to look away. When he turned, Noel was already heading toward the bedroom, pausing once to make sure Matthew followed. He did. That night, Matthew slept deeply. No alarms, no dreams that startled him awake. Just rest. In the morning, he rose to the sound of claws again, steady, familiar, patient. Noel sat by the door, waiting to go outside, tail tapping softly against the wall. Matthew smiled, not because he had saved a dog, but because the last winter before his retirement had ended without taking another, life. And because, in the quiet that followed, there were footsteps where silence had once ruled. Sometimes, the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder or light. They arrive quietly, through a tired heart that still chooses compassion, through a small act of kindness that feels almost invisible. This story reminds us that God often works through ordinary people, a man who thought his purpose had ended, a wounded dog who could barely stand, and a winter night that could have taken another life, but did not. In our daily lives, we may feel old or weak or unsure. We may believe our season of meaning has passed. Yet God places choices before us every day to love instead of turn away, to help instead of remain silent, to stay when it would be easier to leave. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from. And if you believe in quiet miracles and second chances, please press subscribe to support our channel. May God bless you and your family. May He protect you through every storm. And may He remind you that no act of love is ever wasted. If you believe in this message, please comment. Amen. And thank you for supporting our YouTube channel.